Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the Book of Lamentations. Now, the Book of Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah, who was most famously the 40-year prophetic ministry near the tail end. Most of it was spent in the decline stages of Jerusalem, whereby the increasingly inevitable invasion and destruction by the Babylonians, which were the contemporaneous world power, neared the door. And this is post-decline, so this is after the collapse. The book of Jeremiah contains his musings before then. The book of Lamentations is after the fact. Now, some literary context, just some brief notes. It's arranged in what is known as an acrostic. Each chapter has 22 or division or some multiplication of the number. The third chapter has 66 verses, and they're arranged according to the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet appears in the first verse, all the way to 22, etc., etc. And it should be noted that vowels are categorically excluded from the Hebrew alphabet, and another example of an acrostic can be found in Psalm 119, which is the longest chapter in either testament, 176 verses, which are arranged in divisions of 8. 8 by 22 equals 176, so each start with the first letter. I'm not actually intimately familiar, let alone fluent in Hebrew, so if you do want to do a word study, you're on your own, but I wouldn't discourage you from doing it. Now, the first verse reads, "How alone she sits, the city once great with people. Like a widow she has become, one great among the nations, a princess among provinces, has become a slave." So this is a shocking sight to a man like Jeremiah, who was, as a devout Jew, would have valued, treasured, and esteemed Jerusalem as the living presence of Yahweh on earth. Now, a lot of the Psalms are directed to the magnificence of Jerusalem. It was the city established as the capital of the United Kingdom by David. He drove out the Jebusites, which were the indigenous inhabitants. And once the kingdom split after the reign of Solomon into a northern kingdom, which were the 10 uppermost tribes, the kingdom of Judah on the south, largely consisting of the main tribe Judah and Benjamin, remained intact. And she weeps bitterly at night, and her tears are upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is no comforter for her. Now, lovers, we understand the term to be analogous to secular allies, and throughout the Old Testament, a lot of the political dynamics are really expressed in the struggle between the secular rulers placing their faith in alliances, ultimately at the expense of Yahweh, and because any nation that doesn't honor the covenant is not going to be a fit ally for that nation. And a lot of the prophetic dialogues consist of them pleading to the secular rulers, especially Isaiah, to whom the original proclamation of the inevitable doom by Judah at the hands of Babylon consists of them repeatedly, consistently admonishing the rulers to don't put your faith in allies, put your faith above. That's where it belongs. Judah has gone into exile because of affliction and because of harsh labor. She has dwelt among Gentiles. She has found no rest. All her pursuers have overtaken her between narrow places. Now, among Gentiles, interesting bit of history is that the Babylonian captive nation policy differed somewhat, or significantly, actually, from the Assyrians, who had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722. The Babylonian conquest took place in 586 AD. The temple was demolished, the city left in ruins. But the tribe of Judah itself was preserved intact. They were relocated to the capital city, many of them flourished, and ultimately when the 70-year exile had expired, many of them didn't want to leave, frankly. But this was significantly distinct from the Assyrian policy, which was to keep the conquered nations divided. They were threatened by the presence of any ethnically homogeneous people, because that gave them the unity through which to inspire rebellions. So the resettled and relocated captured tribes of Israel were dispersed throughout the empire, where they intermarried and interbred with pagan inhabitants, and the offspring came to be known as Samaritans, and the region they resettled after that came to be known as Samaria, and that the hostility between Jews and Samaritans were mutually antagonistic after the exile period. The Jews did not consider them children of Abraham, and the wall became broken down with the foundation of the Christian faith, and we read in Acts 8 that Philip was the one who evangelized them and brought them fully into the flock. That is the Christian church, the original apostolic one. The ways to Zion mourn, for no one comes to appoint times. All her gates are deserted. Her priests sigh, her maidens are afflicted, and she has bitterness. Now this is the type of language that is indicative of the foul weather faith. It's important to reflect on not just don't anyone ever let you tell you that the Christian life is a bag of roses, because it is not. We're to cultivate the fair weather faith and the foul weather faith in perfect equilibrium, neither at the expense of one another. And you'll never find a prosperity gospel heretic even making passing mention of this book on television, just because it's all sad. But I don't spare you guys the unpleasant necessities and realities of the Christian life. Her adversaries have become chief, her enemies have become at ease, for Yahweh has afflicted her because of her many transgressions. Her children have gone into captivity before the enemy. So we realize that this wasn't purposeless destruction. This was merited, fully merited. The Old Testament is very much encapsulation of the struggle of the covenant people to live up to their end of the covenant, which was a two-way street. Blessings equals obedience, disobedience equals warnings, followed by consequences. And it was ultimately prolonged. An interesting tidbit of information: the sabbatical cycle through which they were commanded in Leviticus 25, 1 through 7, they were commanded to keep the land fallow, or every 7th year. And because that was one of the many violations that they did from the years of Joshua to Jeremiah, was 490 years. That's 70 sabbatical cycles. And that the captivity lasted 70 years. So it was all mathematically precise. But the dishonoring of the sabbatical cycle was far from the only transgression that the Israelites dishonored. They were steeped in sin so as to render them indistinct to the world to whom they were supposed to witness by their mode of living to Yahweh. So again, there's no such thing as purposeless destruction. His wrath is always justified. We may not like it, but you can't say he didn't warn us. All the splendor has departed from the daughter of Zion. Her rulers have become like a buck. They have found no pasture, and they go powerless before the pursuer. This is an agriculturally rooted people. The terminology pasture and pastor, incidentally, feature throughout the Old and New Testament. In the days of her affliction and wandering, Jerusalem remembered all her pleasantries she had in the days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the enemy, when no one helped her. The adversary saw her, they mocked at her destruction. Now, a few of the Psalms are post-exilic, and they actually were written from Babylon, expressing a longing from Jerusalem. I think the 74th one says, if I forget thee above anyone else, thou art my chief joy. I'm just paraphrasing from memory. And Jerusalem has sinned greatly, therefore she has become defiled. All who esteemed her despised her, because they have not seen her nakedness. She herself has sighed and turned away. Now they had not only sinned, but sinned greatly, and that's just not degree, but consistency and repetition. It was not isolated packets. This was mass scale sin by society-wide endemic. And the fact is that many of them gave lip service to they esteemed, but that was merely lip service, but with their actions they despised it, because it was ultimately through the actions as outlined in the covenant that they were to give the witness. It's one thing to profess the faith, it's another thing to possess the faith. And and the fact is that Yahweh would rather have a pagan nation steeped in sin destroy his city than have his own people defile it and desecrate it through not living up to their end or deliberately disregarding the covenant. Her uncleanness is in her skirts. She did not keep in mind her latter end, and has gone down appallingly. There was no one to comfort her. See, O Yahweh, my affliction, for the enemy has made himself great. So this is an expression of isolation and loneliness that only the defeated and dejected know. When and this is ultimately an omen of hell. A lot of people have a misconstrued conception that someone once said, "Oh, I don't mind hell. There's going to be a lot of people when I go down there," but ultimately you instantly evaporate in the fire, and then your immortal soul spends eternity in essential solitude. So there's no one to comfort you, no one to talk to. It's just all darkness, all loneliness. The adversary has spread his hand over all her pleasantries. Indeed, she has seen. The Gentiles have entered her temple, those whom you commanded not to enter your assembly. Now, the Jews were diligent maintainers of the restrictions as outlined by the temple, according to which no Gentiles were to enter. And the Gentiles that did enter certainly did not do so with worshipful intent. They came with the opposite, destructive intent. So that was something they jealously guarded and ultimately squandered through selfishness. All her people are sighing, seeking bread. They have given their pleasantries for food to bring back life. See, O Yahweh, and look, for I have become despised. Is it not to you, all who pass by? Look and see if there is any pain like my pain, which has been brought on me, which Yahweh has inflicted on me, in the days of his burning displeasure. Now, burning displeasure, if you play with the fire of sin, you will get burned. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but eventually you will. And Israel's was a consistent, prolonged period of 409 years, marked with some, good points and good people, but ultimately defined by disobedience. And there is any pain like my pain. Now, when you are in pain, you think that there's no pain. No one could possibly know what you're going through. And this ultimately, it can become an expression of self-centeredness. That's why pain can become, isolate you from empathy and all of the above. But rarely, if ever, is there anyone else enduring unprecedented pain, etc. But it's still a sentiment or an emotion that we should seek to avoid, like the plague. Not that pain in itself isn't a refining process. In this, the Hebrews were distinct from the majority of ancient civilizations, and that they embraced pain as a remedial quality, whereas other cultures were inclined to look at it as weakness, but it's not something they invited or looked forward to. But they did ultimately see the value in it, but not maybe to this extent. From above he has sent fire into my bones, and it overpowered them. He has spread a net for my feet, and turned me back. He has laid me waste and faint all the day. So this is basically saying, again, the fire is repeated, and he's essentially accusing Yahweh of giving him an escape that ended up being a trapdoor, analogously. And this is may be interpreted as a sign of faithlessness, but it's ultimately an expression of honesty. And there's also, we don't have time to get into it, but there's some prayers that may be categorized as imprecatory, which is a prayer for punishment to come to the enemies, and a lot of it seems foreign and alien to Christians, yet it is prolific throughout the Old Testament, and that's something we are ultimately going to have to pick up on next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.